Railway Empire released on the 26th of January and is being developed by Gaming Mind Studios and published by Kalypso Media Digital. Railway Empire is a train management tycoon game set in the USA from the 1830s and advancing all of the way up to the early 1900s. Now I know what you're thinking, trains. You're either a train guy or you're not, and I get it. I'm not a train guy, but this game is better than it has any right to be, and I'm going to break down why in this review. So let's start out with what you're doing in Railway Empire and why you're doing it. Each scenario broadly starts out the same. You'll start out with largely untouched American countryside with around 20 settlements scattered throughout it. You're in charge of one of the first railway companies, and in order to make money, you need to build stations in the settlements, connect them with railways, and then run trains between them to make a profit. Pretty simple so far. To make more money, you want more passengers, and to do that, you'll need to help the settlements thrive and grow. In order to get a settlement to grow, you'll need to deliver the goods it desires. So typically many small settlements will want some grain, corn, and a few other unrefined resources. So what you'll need to do is check around the map for the nearest resource you need, build a station next to it, and connect it back to the settlement. Now you'll have a steady stream of freight trains delivering goods, and once the town has a high enough fulfillment of demand, it'll begin to grow and expand. Things will now begin to get more complicated. As a settlement grows, it'll create an industry. Industries take resources and refine them into different resources, so for a basic example, a slaughterhouse will take cattle and turn it into meat, or a brewery will take wheat and turn it into beer. These are refined resources, and ones like meat and beer are pretty simple to make, they just require one resource to turn into another resource. Now you can probably see where this is going. As settlements grow, they start to require not just the regular resources, but also the refined resources. So you'll need to figure out what towns specialize in what, and create a network of railways that support the settlement's needs. You could have a town making meat, and another town making beer, and they'd ship their goods around to each other so they both have meat and beer to grow. This gets really messy when you have resources that need to be refined multiple times, and a variety of settlements that require or produce all of the different stuff. None of the settlement mechanics would really mean anything if it wasn't for a few core principles of the railway mechanics. For instance, the biggest station you can build is a 4-lane station, and the biggest towns will require 10 or more resources at times. This simply creates a logistical problem where you know multiple lines will end up funneling through choke points, and this is what the game is primarily about. Solving the problem of getting goods to where they should be as quickly as possible without interrupting the flow of other goods. If you do this wrong, you can end up with train traffic jams, trains that carry barely any freight, towns that actually shrink rather than grow, or overly long journey times that don't generate any money. When it comes to physically laying the tracks, the game is pretty good at showing you what the line will look like, the incline between track points, and its cost. The level of incline is actually pretty important. If you're trying to get a train to go uphill, it'll slow down based on how much tractive power it has. The bigger the incline, eventually it will make bridges and tunnels, and it does this all very dynamically and in real time, and you can see the extra costs associated with doing tunnels, bridges, and earthworks. So you'll often want to navigate around mountains and hills to avoid a huge cost, building big tunnels, but it can mean that your line will take a very long time to get to its destination. It's a fun problem to solve. While it works 95% of the time pretty seamlessly, laying the tracks will sometimes kind of bug out, and not really allow for the most basic connection to even be made. This happens a lot when editing a track. You might delete a section and add a new section, but it might not be considered parallel anymore and it won't allow a crossover. It's pretty annoying. It doesn't happen often, but I guarantee you will encounter it. Another factor into the efficiency of your lines is train maintenance. Trains will require servicing regularly and also resupplying. Maintenance can only be performed at stations once you've upgraded them, and supplies like water and oil can only be received on a rail line at a depot. So again, because each of these can cost a lot of money, you need to think about where you can best position them to service as many trains as possible without really slowing down the flow of goods. Now depending on the era, you'll also have an expansive list of technologies to improve your trains or to get all new locomotives that specialize in different things. Now rather disappointingly, trains cannot actually collide. If trains are going to collide, they'll simply stop and not move because there's some sort of dispute on the line. I kinda wish there was a more severe consequence to messing up like that. Seeing a train collide and having to pay out a huge amount of insurance or damages, or just even holding up the line, would be way better. Instead, as I said, if a collision will occur, the trains will just come to a stop until you figure out how to get them running again. There's also an easy mode that turns off collision completely, allowing trains to pass through one another. So I'm not sure why you'd ever do this, as the game just becomes super simple without the logistical problem of multiple train lines, but if you just want to get some practice in with supply and demand of settlements, then maybe it's a good starting point. The very last thing is train personnel. You can assign 4 crew members to a train that come with different little buffs, and based on their characteristics they can work well together or not work well together at all. This to me was completely irrelevant in the game, as you might have 20 or 30 trains running, so it felt really tedious to assign a few crew to a few certain trains just to get a 5% speed bonus or whatever else. It often wasn't really worth the hassle and wasn't very clear to read how they'd get along with each other. I ended up ignoring it for the most part and still being able to get a pretty high rating on the campaign missions. Now that we've got a large part of the mechanics out of the way, it's time to talk about the campaign. Railway Empire features a campaign with 5 distinct chapters. Each chapter is localized to a different part of America and tells the story of the building and completion of the Transcontinental Railway from east to west. Each campaign mission will introduce a historical character who gives you a set of objectives and a time limit. You'll have a certain amount of starting funds and can complete the tasks in any order you want, but you must finish them by the year indicated. For the most part, the tasks are simple enough, such as grow a town, build a certain length of track, earn a certain amount of money, etc, etc. Chapter 1 and 2 are incredibly easy introductions to the game, but Chapter 3 and 4 become much more interesting. With you crossing the Mississippi for the first time, you'll need to transport the materials needed to the river so that the workers there can build a bridge, and the train can move across. Chapter 4 is my favourite, with the American Civil War disrupting the Transcontinental Railway project, and instead requiring you to create weapons and transport them to the front line, as well as move soldiers south and return them home with very tight deadlines. Now, something that I've left out a bit is that there are competitors to your railway empire. A series of characters with their own unique company benefits will be setting up rival stations in the map, earning extra money and expanding, reducing the amount of available passengers and resources that you can transport. This is a further incentive to expand in a cost-effective way so as to keep up with how the AI builds and takes over. They'll even eventually build stations in the same settlements as you and set up as a direct competitor, and they tease you about this constantly.
Come on, budge your station over a bit. There's enough space here for the 2 of us.
Now, on the business tycoon aspect of the game, you can actually buy and invest in the different resources around the map and in the town's individual industries as well. So if you've got the money, you can own the cattle farm that supplies the slaughterhouse, and you can even own the slaughterhouse. However, it's a competitive landscape and often an auction will be held for these businesses. I've had it a few times where I'd love to have a certain business in a town, but that damn Beatrice von Pomp and her fat face would swoop in completely unrelated business that I can't even supply myself.
Oh dear, there seems to be a little problem with one of your locomotives.
It's frustrating in a fun way, and it feels good to own a town's business and supply it yourself. You'll start raking in the cash and your company value will explode. Depending on your company value, you can buy and invest even in your competitors. So if you buy them out completely, you'll get access to all of their stations and trains and they'll be removed. However, the AI doesn't play by your rules and they'll often allow for trains to pass through each other. So I found that purchasing an AI competitor will leave you with train routes that need a lot of work to run effectively. For me, it's pretty rare that you actually buy someone out, but it's definitely discouraging to see that they essentially cheat right in front of you at all times.
One day you'll turn around and I'll be right behind you.
I really enjoyed battling the AI competitors in the campaign, and at the end of each mission you're given a rating, so I still have some incentive to go back and see if I can do better on some of my runs. The story was pretty wholesome, and I enjoyed the historical news tidbits that come along the way, whether they be little jokes or actual newsworthy milestones like the Civil War or the abolishment of slavery. The campaign did feel like it was a little bit short, however, with no late era trains. In fact, half of the trains in the game are reserved for the other modes. It might have been nice to have a campaign mission about modernising your old railways, or going against the competitors all at once instead of just a handful. Railway Empire also features a scenario mode, sandbox mode, and a free mode. Scenario mode features 11 playable scenarios that are comparable to campaign missions, just without the cutscenes and the more involved objectives. They still feature AI, and unlike the campaign missions, they let you change the difficulty involved and choose what AI character you want to play as. These scenarios will go through pretty much all of the eras available and will often have some defining feature that adds a new resource, such as gold for the West's gold rush scenario or oil and petroleum for the South's black gold scenario. These are a lot of fun and they give you timed objectives just like the campaign, but the only issue I found was that there was little to no information on how to use or make use of the new resources. I knew I had to transport 200 loads of gold on my task list, but it seemingly had no demand in any city and no train would use it. Only when I sent it back to my starting location did it actually work, and this was similar with the oil and petrol missions. It seemed like I was missing a tooltip or a bit of information that would have let me know where or why I needed to send it. Ultimately, you will probably figure it out, but it can just be frustrating for the scenario-specific resources. Each scenario in scenario mode lasts around 2 to 3 hours, usually containing around 10 tasks to complete. There's also then sandbox mode, as I mentioned before. This lets you try out any of the 7 maps on any era you want and gives you unlimited money. Really just lets you play about and test different things in the game. There's really not much to it, however the tutorial does leave out some pretty interesting functionality such as prioritizing goods for trains, setting up multiple stations in the same towns, and testing out how trains will use their signals when there's 4 lanes or more. Sandbox mode is great for testing out a theory that you may have in the main game modes. Free mode, which is the final mode, lets you choose any of the 7 maps on any era and add up to 3 competitors of varying difficulty. It also lets you change your starting money and your starting town, so it's basically just a customizable mode where you play the AI. This mode is also fun if you're just looking for a more random type game, but the only drawback is that you can't choose what AI come into the game with you. There's 6 characters to choose from, so it can be a bit random who you actually get in your game. Now before we wrap up, I wanted to mention how the game runs and how it looks. On a technical level, the game is extremely smooth. I never experienced any slowdown or lag, regardless of how many trains were on screen, and it was always running at around 100 FPS for me. Now in the settings, however, it could only ever run on normal or low, with very little customization there. I find this to be pretty odd, as the game apparently utilizes Gaming Minds' own engine, but it seems more like a console port than anything in terms of its settings. And for the actual look of the game, it's pretty good. You'll spend most of your time pretty high up looking down across the continent, and from here is where it does look best. The trains themselves have great detail and they're a lot of fun to follow along their journeys, and the towns themselves have a lot more detail and life in them than they really ever needed to be honest. That all being said, it's not going to win any awards for pushing the boundaries of graphical capability, but for a tycoon game, it's quite good. In fact, it runs so well, it's a shame they didn't have the budget or the inclination to push a few more polygons and really make it look cutting edge. So that pretty much does it for Railway Empire. I said at the beginning that this game is better than it has any right to be, and that's because it's an extremely niche train management game set in the 1800s. I mean, on paper, it's a game that I personally have no interest in, but when I first saw it, something drew me in, and when I'm playing it, it just got its hooks into me. It's the perfect game to throw on a podcast and work away on your railway lines for hours on end, and when it's all said and done, it's really satisfying to look back across what was once a barren map and is now a thriving network of goods moving around. Now its asking price can feel a little bit steep for what it is. There's no getting around it that its price point pits it against some of the biggest AAA games out there, and while it does have some shortcomings, I can pretty much guarantee you'll just have fun with the game like I did. I just enjoy it and I want to play more of it. My best comparison is to the old Tycoon game, The Movies. That was a game that was just really good. Nobody really asked for a game where you ran a movie production business, but good mechanics, some humor, some steady progression, and a solid engine made that game one of the most memorable Tycoon games ever. And for me at least, Railway Empire reignites that feeling of some random game that I never asked for, stealing 50 hours of my life. That's all for this review. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know what you think of the game and what you think of the video. Remember, these reviews are pretty much completely fan funded, and if you want to support this channel and help support more reviews like this, head on over to Patreon or just give the video a like. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.